Since the year 2000, on the third Monday of January, all 50 states in America observe Martin Luther King Day. It's a day to reflect on the work and efforts of the civil rights activist Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in 1968. King's work in the fight for civil rights was legendary, and his impact stretches to the world of sports. Joining me today to talk about MLK and his impact on sports is a great journalist for Andscape and author $40 Million Slave, the one and only Bill Rhoden. Bill, long time no see. How you doing?
How you been, man? How's it going? Happy Dr. King Day.
Happy Dr. King Day to you, too. I thought you were the perfect person just because of your experience, just writing sports, being around for a long time. I thought you were the perfect person to talk about this and wanted to have a conversation with you about it. And Bill, when we as a society talk about Dr. King, I think many people think of his great speeches, marches, leading protests, and how he inspired so many people in this country. And some of those people who were inspired by King were athletes. So I've got to ask you this. How did Dr. King impact black athletes, and how do you think he understood the power of sports?
Well, that's a great question. Again, thanks for having me. I do remember, well, his impact was so vast, and I think that the civil rights movement was such an all-encompassing thing. And if you remember, I know for a lot of people who see an NBA that's almost 60, 70% of the players are black, and the NFL, and you see, almost 67% of the players are black. I think people forget that the reason why so many black athletes were part of the civil rights movement, whether it was passively or actively, joining Dr. King's marches, or if not joining those marches directly, were fighting for their own civil rights. I think that back in the mid to late 50s and the 60s, the NFL and the NBA did not look like this. College football and basketball did not look like this. It was very segregated. Schools had quotas, and in places down the South, look at a place like University of Alabama, which their football team looks like Howard now because it's so black. But they didn't really get their first black player, until 1972, the first scholarship athlete. So to answer the question, I think that all the athletes, the black athletes who were fighting for equality and freedom, were part of the civil rights movement. Now, did Dr. King, I think he was brought into the power of sports by guys like Harry Edwards, who formed the Olympic Project for Humanity. And I remember they had several meetings with Dr. King because they wanted to have an Olympic boycott. And I think that, Dr. King understood the power of sports in terms of numbers, and people like Jackie Robinson was a big supporter. And clearly, Dr. King embraced Jackie Robinson because of everything he meant. A guy like Kurt Flood also tried to recruit a lot of athletes to go in the South. Bill Russell, same thing. Bill Russell, at the invitation of Medgar Evers, went to Mississippi and did a basketball clinic in Mississippi. So whether it was Dr. King reaching out directly or some of his lieutenants reaching out, I think that there was a very profound effect. He had a very profound impact. The movement that he galvanized, he created, had a very profound movement among African Americans in sports, either directly, heck, if you look at the March on Washington, the great George Raveling, legendary George Raveling. If you look at Dr. King's speech, George Raveling had been recruited to be on the podium with Dr. King as a quote bodyguard. I mean, he was still at Villanova at the time, but he was there, and he actually has Dr. King's original speech. So, to answer your question, Dexter, I mean, the civil rights movement that Dr. King led had an amazing impact on black athletes at the collegiate level, at the professional level, because we were all fighting for the same thing. We were all fighting for access.
Yeah, all fighting for access, and that's true. There's no doubt about the impact he had. And that brings me to the next thing here, Bill, because as much as we can talk about the impact that King had on black athletes, do you look at it the other way? Did athletes have an impact on King in terms of recognizing their place in the fight for civil rights?
That's a good question. I think that his plate was so full. And again, remember, I think if Dr. King were here today, I'm always wondering about that. You know, when you see what Kaepernick tapped into, I always wondered if Dr. King were alive today, if Malcolm were alive today, how would they mobilize what has now become a very fierce presence in sports? But um, you know, I think the impact. I don't know if it was like a direct impact. I think he was a fan. You know, I mean, he was a fan of obviously Jackie Robinson. He was a fan of, although he was younger, he grew up being a fan of like a Joe Louis. Um, I think with Ali, I think he understood. I know that there's certain pictures of Dr. King with Ali. I think he was a fan of Ali's potential to galvanize people. So yeah, I think that they had athletes, black athletes, had an impact on Dr. King. I'm not sure that it would have been as immense as it would have been today when the numbers are just greater. Sports is just such, it has become something that we could have even imagined during
That,
Dr. King's lifetimes. But
right.
definitely the other way, Dexter, definitely the other way. I think he had an impact on I think he created a civil rights movement within sports.
Yeah, no doubt about that for sure. You kind of mentioned this. The professional sports league that holds the highest percentage of African American players in the United States is the NBA. You touched upon them. And the league for years now, they've had a full slate of games on Martin Luther King Jr. Day to honor Dr. King. What have you made of the NBA's efforts to honor King, and what have players, I know you've talked to many players over the years, what have they told you about what it means to play on MLK Day?
I mean, hey, I like the fact that they're keeping his legacy alive. I respect the NBA for that. And you know, I mean, there are a lot of young guys who clearly, you know, their grandparents may remember Dr. King. I think it was just the good thing about it is that it's just a special day, and some of the more uh, and aggressive athletes, not aggressive, but studious athletes, I'm sure did their diligence and found out about who Dr. King was, what he did, what the country was like. You know, the reason why the NBA is, has 79% black players. The reason why there are a number of black head coaches, a couple team presidents, is because of the civil rights movement that Dr. King created. So I like the idea of the NBA having that game just to keep the legacy alive. And I always appreciate young guys who do study history and they understand, man, what was this country like for my grandparents and for my great grandparents? It was not a very comfortable place, and people like Dr. King pushed and pushed and pushed. And I think there, I mean, Dexter, I was speaking of Derek Jeter, but I think what he really did for young black athletes is made them understand that there is no progress without struggle, that everything you're enjoying now is because people like Dr. King pushed. People just are not going to give you things. And I guess what I always wonder, it kind of gets back to your first question, is if Dr. King were alive today, and I really, that his kind of organization skills are really needed today when you do have this great black presence. I'm still not sure. I think the movement is kind of floundering, because on the surface, everything looks so great. Everything looks so peachy.
But
Um,
obviously to that point there still are issues, right? There still are issues that face the black community, that face the black athlete. That's there. Yeah, you're getting into something I want to touch on with my next question, because you kind of lead us right into the place I wanted to go to, right? Because you hit up on this, Bill, considering in recent years, right, we've seen athletes like Colin Kaepernick, who you mentioned, Maya Moore, fighting to reform, criminal justice system and bring awareness to systemic racism. How do you think King would have viewed the civil rights efforts of black athletes today? How do you think he would have looked at it and what athletes have been doing today to still fight for civil rights?
well, obviously, he would have loved it. And given his organizational skills and given the money and the wealth that these athletes are created now, I definitely, I definitely feel that he would have found a way to bring them into the fold, bring them into the movement in a very powerful and organized way. I love to. I mean, who knows what he would have done when Colin Kaepernick was organizing, was kneeling. I think that if Dr. King were alive, and again, who knows, man, but it's a great question. I think were he alive, he would have known how to keep that movement going. There would have been a strategy. It wouldn't have just been Colin here and somebody kneeling here and somebody there. I think there would have been a strategy. How do we organize a movement to put pressure on NFL owners? I think he would have been very effective in the Deep South, organizing young college-bound athletes. His one of the models was "Don't shop where you can't buy." And even today, we have an awful problem of trying to get black head coaches, football coaches, in the Power Five. And I think that Dr. King would have been very, very deft at leaning on black parents and AAU coaches to really put pressure, not just on one school, but throughout leagues, particularly in the South, saying, you have got to pay a price to get this black talent from these black communities to enrich your schools, enrich your coaches. I don't think that there's been an effective movement to really put pressure, particularly at the college level. But yeah, he would have loved Colin Kaepernick. He would have loved Maya Moore. I think that he would have created a structure, a more organized structure, so that the movement didn't just disappear with Maya Moore, or it didn't disappear when they got rid of Colin Kaepernick. I think he would have organized something that would have been far more sustaining.
Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things is I think, no matter what, everybody who loves the impact he had, I think you're saying this and people would say, you know what, he still would have been fighting for civil rights today as he would have been 95 years old. But the impact of Dr. King, no doubt, felt through the country and, as we said, through the world of sports. That is Bill Rhoden, one of the great journalists of our time, writing for Andscape. Bill, always a pleasure when I see you, always a pleasure when I talk to you. Thank you for the great work that you do, and we will talk soon.
All right, take care. Thanks so much.